press OK, continue.
Oh no.
We okay?
All right.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's really, really nice to see all of the panelists as well as all our attendees here today. And I'd like to welcome you all to the Public Symposium on Religion and Nonprofit Leadership. My name is Tina Shepherdson. I'm the current department head of the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Tennessee. And we're here today thanks to my colleague, Dr. Rosalind Hackett, who has sort of picked up the ball in our department to teach our new religion and nonprofit leadership class that my colleague Megan Bryson started. This is part of a program I'm going to put in the chat. So this is a new concentration within our department. So you can now major or minor as undergraduates in religion and nonprofit leadership. So we're very excited that this program is in its second time being taught now, first by Dr. Bryson, now by Dr. Hackett. And we're very excited about this public symposium with all of you folks who are here to participate and to attend. So it is hosted through the Department of Religious Studies. It is co-sponsored thanks to the Haynes Morris Fund, as well as the Consortium for Social Enterprise Effectiveness, as well as UT's Haslam College of Business. So with that, I will thank all of you for all of your participation, and I look forward to listening. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Javiet Samuel, who is the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Director of Community Engagement and Outreach at the University of Tennessee. Javiet,
yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. It's a pleasure for me to be here serving as your moderator tonight. As has been mentioned, I'm Javiet Samuel, and I'm here on campus as your Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity Engagement and Director of Community Engagement and Outreach. And in our division and office and everything that we do, we're always thinking about and seeking ways to elevate the knowledge and co-create new knowledge in terms of both on campus, but also with our amazing partners, many of which we have in the meeting and on the panel. So I'm always excited to hear about multidisciplinary efforts, ways in which that we can, again, connect, thinking about the important role that religion plays as it relates to nonprofits, thinking about the important role that nonprofits play as it relates to religion, and just thinking about the many, many ways that you will hear from our local experts, but also national experts alike, just in terms of the way we do what we do. I'm super excited about what we have in store. I will again serve as your moderator. And what that means is I'm gonna keep you on time, Dr. Askew. I'm gonna keep you on time, Father Reagan. I'm gonna, Pastor Battle, I'm gonna keep everybody exactly where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be there. We're gonna, it's a lively and great group for those of you that might not necessarily know who our esteemed speakers are, but I will definitely ensure, as I mentioned earlier, that it'll be fun and lively, but we will get your questions answered. And so you'll have an opportunity to hear from an amazing keynote speaker, Professor Marshall, and then we will go into some Q&A for the keynote, open it up to the roundtable guests and panelists, and then we'll come back together as a larger group so we can have and dive some more discussion and dive into just a little bit more conversation and information about the last half hour. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for you in terms of what to expect. Again, we have some amazing local members of the clergy, but also faculty and practitioners and executive directors of nonprofits. So you're in for a real treat tonight. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Hackett.
Thank you very much, Javiet. I hope you can all see the program. Can you see the program? Yes, good, thank you. So we will just move through to our keynote speaker, Q&A for that, and then a roundtable speakers. And please note that I will be doing an introduction for our keynote speaker, but we haven't got time to introduce our 7 speakers. Javiet, if you could perhaps just announce their name and their affiliation, and then you could find their bios on our department webpage for this event, all right? And then we have closing remarks, all right? So I'll stop the share. Right, so it is really just an enormous pleasure to welcome both panelists and our keynote speaker and colleagues, friends, students, former students, interested parties to this very groundbreaking event, at least for our department. As Dr. Shepherdson has said, we are this is the 2nd time this course has been taught, Religion and Nonprofit Leadership, and it marks a trend in departments of religious studies trying to develop courses that are slightly more professionally oriented to equip our students to go out and engage the world. So I very much enjoyed teaching the class this semester and have a lively group, many of whom are going to go on into nonprofit work. So on behalf of them, I want to thank our panelists, especially for sharing their experience and knowledge. But it's my job here to introduce and to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Katherine Marshall, who I will say up front is a longstanding friend and colleague of mine. And in fact, I'll be honest, I'll say she's one of my heroes. And I think you'll understand why when you hear her speak, or perhaps you already heard her speak on WUT yesterday, where she did just a terrific overview of the fields and the sort of paradigmatic shifts in the relationship between religion and global development. But let me say that I'm especially grateful that we can manage to attract Katherine, at least virtually, although we're very disappointed we couldn't get her down to Knoxville for the first time. But that is going to happen another time. Because I know, I have ample evidence that Katherine Marshall is one of the busiest people I know, and before COVID, certainly one of the most globe-trotting colleagues and friends that I have. And so I know about her nonstop life as a pretty devoted life as a scholar, a teacher, a speaker, a consultant, a writer, a human rights advocate, an activist. So we're just grateful that she's found the time to join us here today. And she's very much in demand because she has such a vast area of expertise and such a vast experience. I know she's going to allude to that in part. But if you want to get a sense of her incredible corpus of publications, academic or academic activist or country reports, she writes for such diverse audiences. I just recommend that you go beyond her bio and look her up on Google, Google publications, and you will see just the various areas that she contributes to and writes pace-setting pieces for under this rubric of religion in and global development, whether it's refugees, gender-based violence, public health issues, the pandemic, and education. So she really has, this is why she's so much in demand, because she has such a lot of strings to her bow. So I will just, for those of you who haven't seen the official bio, if you don't mind, I will read that out because I want to make sure that you're aware of her key achievements and her key roles at this moment in time. Professor Marshall is a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, where she leads the center's work on religion and global development. And she's also a professor of the practice of development, conflict, and religion in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. She helped to create and now serves as the executive director of the World Faith Development Dialogue. Katherine Marshall, who worked at the World Bank from 1971 to 2006, has nearly 5 decades of experience on a wide range of development issues in Africa, Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East. She led the World Bank's Faith and Ethics Initiative between 2000 and 2006. Marshall's recent publications include Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, Illuminating the Unseen with Susan Hayward. That was published by the U.S. Institute of Peace in 2015, and Global Institutions of Religion, Ancient Movers, Modern Shakers, Routledge 2013. And she's currently spearheading an online platform on COVID-19, exploring faith dimensions. I particularly recommend that to you. Katherine, you are warmly welcome to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, particularly the Department of Religious Studies. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, for that lovely, warm introduction. And I do deeply wish that I were with you in person, but as we all know, we are living in unusual, interesting times. And we are living, I've called the talk Forks in the Road, Religious Challenges and the COVID Crisis, because we are living in a remarkable year. With common global experience. It's something, I think, the first time in history that we've seen a common crisis shaking the entire world. And we are still very much in a raging storm that will clearly mark history. It will be in the history books. And meanwhile, we're working to survive the uncertain present while we're looking to the future. So to sort of give you a hint of the bottom lines, and then I'll give you an outline of how I'm proposing to spend this time with you. And I look forward very much to the panel discussion. Early in the pandemic, we were looking at the history of epidemics, from the plague to HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and more. And we've done quite a bit of work on all of them. And we saw for a road ahead that had very different forks. There was the worst of humanity, with conflicts and scapegoating linked to fears and efforts to protect and save those that were the closest to us. But we also saw the best of humanity, calls for a global ceasefire, science at the service of humanity, selflessness and compassion, awareness of interconnection, humanity in a common plight, extraordinary generosity. So the basic question I'm asking is, where are we now as we look towards these two forks? And I think we clearly are seeing 3 global challenges. I think one, the first, is that the direction and efficiency of states, of governments that link us in multiple ways is taking on new importance and a new character. Secondly, we're looking at the threads of institutions and leadership beyond the state, where we're looking at business, education, science, family, essential workers, sort of in some, it's about partnerships and interdependence and interconnection. And then the third is that we need to explore the nature of cultural features that unite and divide. I taught a freshman seminar on the COVID crisis. It was on pandemics. And the question of why different communities in different countries have responded so differently was right at the center. So I want to reflect on some directions that the forks in the road might take. The storm is still very much with us, with areas of blue sky, but also tornadoes that are passing by. So what might be the areas for action and some tipping points? So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to reflect a bit on my own journey. How did I get here? What on earth took me to this rather unusual juncture of roads that Rosalind described, and what sort of perspectives come from that? I'm then going to talk a bit about the tensions between charity and rights that takes us to the heart of the question of nonprofit missions, then bring religion in more explicitly, pointing to some areas of tension, but also hope, and then conclude. So to move on to my journey, I'm going to start with a story. Some years ago, when I was in the World Bank as an operational manager, I was visiting a country where there were some serious human rights tensions. I won't name the country, but I was there as the representative, the director for the World Bank, but I also was representing essentially the donor community, including NGOs. And the main preoccupation there was human rights. And there were some very serious violations, what we call extrajudicial killings, but also expropriation, some discrimination against some ethnic groups, et cetera. And my job was to put these issues in front of the government. So I was visiting an area a few hours from the capital with the Minister of Agriculture, who very clearly did not want to be in the car, as he was, with this American woman who was there with a mission he had no wish to discuss. Human rights was not of interest. So we had a few hours and I tried to figure out what to discuss with him. So I started, because it was a desert country, with camels. I think he knew every camel in the country by name. He had owned, clearly, a lot of camels. It was very much part of his ethos and culture. So we had a long, fascinating discussion about milk and hooves and hides and meat, trade, etc. But then we had to move on. So I asked him about cattle, and he knew less about cattle than finally sheep and goats and sort of poultry. But then we came to a village, very much an African village. And everywhere that I looked, I could see donkeys, children on donkeys, moving house, water, etc., thatch for the roofs. So I asked him, I said, what about donkeys? And his answer was, we have no donkeys. So I looked around and I said, well, what about what I'm seeing? And he said, it's unimportant. So there are a couple of lessons that I took from this. The first one is that there are very different ways of seeing the same reality. For him, agriculture and fighting poverty was really about a desert culture. And the kind of village culture that he saw was very alien to him. His view was colored by motivation. And as far as he was concerned, it was really not important, so that he didn't even see it. It was part of his culture. Whereas for me, an African village was what we were concerned about. It was the people who were often suffering and in misery. But it was a fascinating adventure journey for me to have to look at how differently people could see the same reality, even when it's in front of your nose. And we call it sometimes a shift in paradigms, a real different ways of appreciating even the reality when you don't even get into the facts. So that's sort of, I'm going to come back a couple of times to this question of seeing things differently, because in my particular journey of trying to link religion and development, state and nonprofit, the different ways of seeing things is important. And obviously, with all of us so concerned about polarization in the United States, it's not very far removed from those issues. So basically, let me give you a very quick personal background. I grew up in a family where it was assumed that service was vital. That was your mission in life. But it was also about adventure and discovery. We moved quite a bit, so that was important. And my father moved to Nigeria right after independence. And the excitement of new countries coming into being created was very much part of that. And in my time there, very young, I was at school in England, the notions of poverty sort of took hold. The misery of it, the disease, whether it was cholera or other kinds of aspects of poverty, but also the opportunity and the sense that we had really something very new, which was the possibility of doing something about poverty, which had been part of the human condition forever. I moved then and worked at the World Bank for many years, 35, I have to confess, which is a long time. And in many ways, the World Bank, well, let's put it this way, it's very clearly a not-for-profit organization, but I don't think you'd count it in your nonprofit. It's a multilateral organization owned by 192 governments, and it works within the constraints of government, but it also translates ideals into practice. And on the front door, there is in marble, fighting poverty with passion and professionalism, and our dream is a world free of poverty. So that's the ideal. However, I took a major turn in direction when the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, in 1999, in other words, before 9/11, at a very different time, asked me to help him with an effort to build bridges between the development world and the religious worlds, which were frankly at each other's throats at the time. And that adventure, because I had no background in it, it was not what I had really chosen, was a challenge to see the same issues that I had been working with in new ways. It always reminds me of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, coming back to the place you were and seeing it for the first time. So what I'm working on now is many different issues, but the two that take most of my time are working with a G20 Interfaith Forum, which is the powerful nations of the world, which meet once a year, but have now an interfaith group. And the aim is to bring the best of the wisdom and ideas of religion into global agendas, where frankly, they have been largely ignored. And we are also working very much on the COVID response and started in early March last year. So we have over a year now of day-to-day experience of saying what is happening with gatherings, what's happening with practice, what's happening with the social response, what's happening with conflict resolution and discrimination, etc. So I work in constantly building bridges. I sometimes say that bridges get walked on. It's not an easy bridge to build, but it is also fascinating. And it brings us constantly into very, very different ways of seeing realities, as my minister saw his reality versus the one that I saw. So reflecting on the symposium title, I do want to do a very quick comment on definitions, which we always know are important. The first is that the word religion is a very tricky one, where people are very little agreement, even within a single discipline, about what we're talking about. But when you cross about, we looked for a review recently, 14 different disciplines that deal with religious matters in one way or another. So it's an enormously diverse field. But one thing, a number we come back to constantly reminding people is that a very reputable survey says that 84% of the world's population has a religious affiliation. So that's a very large percentage of the world's population, and it's obviously important. But the other fact of it is that it's sensitive, it's complicated. We were often taught not to discuss religion and politics at the dinner table, but it is also enormously important. And so I commend all of you for the work that you do. The nonprofit is even more complicated because it sort of makes a binary with profit making, i.e. sort of business. But of course, it includes a wide variety of institutions that include universities, the World Bank, tiny community level groups, religiously, non-religious. In fact, many people refer to faith-based organizations or FBOs, which are basically like an NGO, but with a religious character. We found that, in fact, many don't like that title, particularly in the Muslim world. And so we actually call them faith-inspired organizations, which I find more attractive, but it hasn't fully taken on, and people still talk about FBOs, CSOs. And just for those of you who are not familiar, you have bingos and lingos. So bingos are big NGOs and lingos are little NGOs. Gongos are government-sponsored NGOs. So to give you a flavor of the complexity of what we're talking about. So the objective, though, we hope or assume of most nonprofits, as well as religion, I think you could say they share a common goal of doing good and improving the lives of people in the world. There is a tension, obviously, between sort of direct local involvement and small scale and policy between global and local that cuts across both religion and the nonprofit organizations of many different kinds, big and small, local and global. So I'm going to turn now to some questions about charity and rights, humanitarian development, progress, because these are all now contested terms. The tradition, but also the present reality, is that compassion and empathy are some of the most critical elements in human condition and improving them. But there are some issues around traditional approaches to charity, particularly approaches that involve benefits to the giver more than to the receiver. And so there's a lot of critique about charity now, even though it is still vital. But then we talk about human rights, and there is the right to development. And it underscores the need for shifts in our paradigms about how we look at this. So rights are sometimes described as linked to dignity. And I do ask myself, as I hear it so often these days in the context of Black Lives Matter or Me Too, et cetera, do we really need to be told that our fellow human beings are human, that there is this common bond of equality that is fundamental? But it seems that we do need to be told. But this question of rights is grounded on that. And when you talk about the right to development, it basically means that it's not because of charity that children go to school or that they have a COVID vaccine in a faraway place, or that the women have a right to development. It is something that is part of justice and rights, and finding ways to disentangle this is a major challenge. So we have to learn from experience of what development means. It's been a sobering process because there have been extraordinary successes, but also many questions about what we mean. Trying to measure it, we know we measure what we treasure, but we also treasure what we measure. So we get into a lot of traps. I'm going to give a couple of illustrations of issues that have arisen around the journey that I have taken for the last 21 years of trying to look at the links to build bridges between religion and development, and give you a couple of illustrations. One of the most contentious issues right now, ironically, is around orphanages. And the reason is that orphanages are a fundamental part of many religious traditions and of history. And it's part of compassion that orphans needed special care. And orphanages are often seen as an oasis. But there is also a sort of scientific consensus that orphanages are the worst way to deal with orphans because they are open to abuse, but still more they prevent the integration of the child in the society and the community and cut them off from the family that they do have, even when there are cases of abuse. So there's a certain amount of tension between different groups that arose, for example, around the HIV/AIDS crisis, when there were so many orphans that it propelled a new look at that. Let me give you another example. This is from Eastern Africa, and a country where people were looking at the question of how do you distribute mosquito nets and who do you consult? And it was an interesting case because they had hired anthropologists who interviewed the chiefs and their wives, worried about polygamy and who would have the net in a polygamous family, what would happen to the children. But I asked the question of, did you consult the religious leaders? And this was an enormously religious country. And their eyes went blank because they had not really thought of the religious as part of the society, as part of the community, which is an illustration of some of the problems. There are enormous tensions around proselytism. And it's a fascinating challenge because proselytism, the right to talk about your faith and to seek to convert others, is very fundamental to understandings of religious freedom. It is, however, something that bothers people in many societies because they feel that it's disruptive of their culture. Where I come into it is when there is the appearance of a quid pro quo. In other words, that there's some conditionality that unless you go to church, you don't get food in a refugee camp. That is clearly, everyone would agree that it is ethically not the right way to approach it, and it's something to be aware of. So the basic message here is that these questions of charity and rights, what is a humanitarian act, what is development, what kind of society do we want to build, is something that we need to keep asking and not take for granted. And that's one of the lessons that I've taken from the challenges that many religious institutions have put to some of what are frankly pretty stuck assumptions that economists and other disciplines have had about what's right for development. I'm going to turn now to the question of what religion has to do with it at this fork of the road. And these are the basic questions that my current work forces me or encourages me to ask. What's religion got to do with education or with healthcare or with land tenure or with food security? And then the second question you have to ask is, why does that matter? Is it big? Is it small? Is it contentious? Is it for good or not? And then how does that translate into policy? And basically, it amounts to a question of people's paradigms. One of the challenges, which I'm not going to go into, is that introducing religion into the development community has in fact been enormously controversial. Many have said that this is not a place it belongs, it's in the private, it's a private matter. But we've said with so much work, so many missions, so many institutions, faith-inspired organizations, understandings of corruption, of human nature, their voices belong at the table, but it does raise the question of which voices and which tables. So to give you, again, just a few thoughts on what are the issues at the moment, we're clearly seeing constant sessions and discussions, webinars on religion and science that are sparked particularly by the COVID crisis. It's not a new issue. You know about the Scopes trial, the question of the origin of species, but the issues of how do science and religion go together is very forcibly on the table now. And it is, I think we have been following this for a year, have tens of thousands of different links. It's very clear that the vast majority of religious people and religious institutions are deeply imbued with an understanding of science, but there are many who still question. Some of the questions are valid. Some of them are more open to question. The second area that's been critically important, and that is something particular to focus on, is something we care so much about, and that is trust, as well as leadership. Now, trust, there have been many surveys, and in many of these surveys, if you ask, who do you trust? Police, government, NGOs, universities, scholars, scientists, religious leaders, almost always the winners are the religious leaders. And so that has been a very critical issue. One of the areas that I've become deeply involved in is thinking about ethics and morality. Not always the same thing. We can't go into that right now. But one of the fascinating things is that maybe not religious institutions may not be more ethical, but they certainly talk about it and think about it more, so that it puts an important and fascinating range of issues on the table. And a final point that I will make that's been part of my experience, and it's part of my experience, of course, started with being the first woman doing what I was doing and feeling often that people thought I didn't belong, that the reactions to talking about women's roles was often very emotional. People were thinking about their families and about themselves and their own views. And it's been very true of religion also. It's very difficult to have professional discussions about religion. And so I think we do need to find ways to step back and to ask what are sometimes tough questions. I'm not sure, how am I doing on time? Will you tell me? I lost track. Someone?
Yeah, you're doing fine. You've got about
You have about 2 minutes.
yes,
Okay, so it's almost time to wind up.
2 minutes, yes, 2
Okay,
minutes.
so I'm just going to tell one story that I'm going to link to vaccine equity, and then I'm going to try to wind up. The story, a big issue now is who gets vaccines first, and vaccine nationalism and even vaccine apartheid are a big issue. And I see this as a major role for religious institutions. And I'm going to compare that to another experience I had when I was working on Niger as the country director at a time when less than 20% of children were in school. And we visited a classroom with 110 children sitting on the ground. And I went home, and my son was looking at preschools at the time. And his class would be 16 with computers, color, toys, and the simple contrast and raw unfairness is basically what drives me. And I think that it also needs to drive us as we look at the issues of vaccines. So with that, I think it is time to focus on the future with compassion, with science, with emotion, with professionalism, with ethics, and with balance. And to take advantage of this fork in the road, to look at them in the mirrors, look at colonial instincts and bias, look at the meaning of inclusion, look at new ideas that we're getting from the COVID pandemic. And we need to link three things. One is our understanding of religious freedom and the important role that the freedom of conscience means for everyone. How do we think about that in a diverse religious world that's moving fast and changing? Secondly, we talk about religious engagement. In other words, having these religious communities and ideas and experience at the table. And finally, we need to look at religious literacy. And that, I think, is where universities in this world in 2021 have a central responsibility to make sure that all students and all faculty have an understanding of this complex, vital role of religion as they look to the future. And I think as we look at the forks in the road, as we look at different priorities, our understanding of what work is essential, what kind of lives we want to lead, these kinds of insights, these kinds of challenges, I think can help us to take the right fork in the road. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving us some real good food for thought, some things to chew on, to consider as we think about the forks in the road, as we think about various paradigms and different ways that individuals can look at the same reality, as we think about the multiple ways that the nonprofit sector, both locally and globally, interacts with and overlaps with religious communities, human rights, building bridges. I've got so many nuggets from that, and hopefully our audience did as well. At this juncture, now we will have an opportunity to come back to Professor Marshall a little bit later, but if you have a burning high-level question, just one question that's really burning, feel free to pop that in the chat, and I am happy to pose that question to the professor, and she can give us some thoughts and insight there. And I'm telling you, our panelists are fired up, so they have questions. I'm seeing their questions. I'm going to try to table, unless I get one from the audience, I will table this one. I'll give you about another 10 seconds or so to jump in and type. Meanwhile, Professor Marshall, one of the questions that we have from a fellow panelist is, how might faith-inspired organizations help fight poverty more in the US?
I think that they are deeply involved in day-to-day fighting for poverty. I've been trying to track, even in the area where I live in Washington, D.C., the extraordinary efforts of soup kitchens and people fighting eviction, people working with the homeless, some of the signs of misery, and with children, of course, which is always our central preoccupation. There also are a lot of groups that are deeply involved in advocacy. There was something called the Circle of Protection, which was formed by a group of religious actors who really follow the budget discussions, because we all know if you want to know where action is, look at the budget, follow the money. So I think you have this range from the very, very local to the very national. I think we haven't had a very good conversation in the United States about what poverty is and what the real causes are. And I would like to see in the post-COVID period much more reflection on how we're defining. I mean, the poverty line doesn't tell us very much. What kinds of paths lead us in positive directions, and how do we bring together the lessons from the extraordinary range of groups that are working on the problem?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, could you speak to the allocation of resources and global financial inequities?
That, well, first of all, I think the problem that I'm most deeply concerned about is the problem of inequality. And we all know that that is something that's been here for a long time. I don't think there's ever been a time when there wasn't some form of inequality, but the levels of inequality have been exposed starkly by the COVID crisis. And in fact, the projections coming from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund today, are really highlighting that you have a fork in the road of recovery, with some countries, including the US, probably recovering quickly, but other countries becoming poorer and not able to do that. Now, the resources, first of all, most resources for development come from countries themselves, but there's been a huge shift away from direct foreign aid to private investment, private flows, including remittances. And unfortunately, the amount of money that's involved in philanthropy, with the exception of the Gates Foundation and others like it, is really pretty limited. It's a very small fraction of the flows, and it can make a huge difference, but it's not solving the problem financially. So again, what happens the vaccine issue is the most immediate test of, because we all know we're not going to be safe until everyone in the world is vaccinated. And at the moment, people are talking about 10 years from now before poor countries are fully vaccinated. So this question of seeing the interconnectedness, seeing the human family, to put it in the abstract sense, but in a practical sense, making sure that all countries have access to vaccines quickly, and that within countries, it's the vulnerable people, the health workers, teachers, older people who have priority.
Yes, and I think you are absolutely correct. I think all of us have known about some of the disparities and gaps and inequities, particularly among Black, Indigenous people of color, communities of color, and poor people. And those issues have just been exacerbated with and through COVID. So thank you again so much. Again, participants, we will have another opportunity to hear from Professor Marshall, but at this juncture, we are going to transition to roundtable speakers. And we're going to start with my dear friend, Dr. Jerry Askew, President of the Alliance for Better Nonprofits and Archdeacon of the Episcopal Diocese of East Tennessee. So if you could give us your hopes and thoughts and dreams and ways in which all things nonprofit and religion bridge gaps, and how, what you do personally, what your organizations do personally, that would be great. You're muted, my friend.
You can now check your bingo card for the first one.
There you go.
I thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part, and thank you so much, Professor Marshall, for a really great, inspirational way of looking at the world. It made me think. Let me start with an apology. Over the next 5 to 7 minutes, I will say the pronoun I far more than my comfort zone normally allows, but we were asked to talk a little bit about ourselves and what we do, and so I'll ask for a little grace. I'm so pleased to be on this panel with so many of my friends and others who I hope will become friends, because frankly, one of the true joys of living in Knoxville since 1985 has been the opportunity to walk with my brothers and sisters from so many faith traditions as we all try to serve a God that we call by many names and experience in so many different ways. And so it's nice to see so many of you on the screen. I've been thinking for a long time about how religion and nonprofit leadership intersect. And the truth is that my life over the past 20 years or so has been defined in large part by that intersection. I'll spare you my spiritual and professional autobiography, but I would like to comment on my journey over the last 7 years. On my 60th birthday, 7 years ago, I walked the Via Dolorosa in Old Jerusalem at 5 o'clock in the morning. And during that journey, I felt this intense pull. I will call it, I think more appropriately call it a call, to commit my fourth quarter, that would be from ages 60 to 80, my fourth quarter to serving God, both that transcendent God and the immanent God that resides within all of God's creation. And that call I adopted as the unifying theme for the rest of my life. I didn't know how it would play out at the time, and it's played out in some interesting ways. At 62, I took my life vows and was ordained in the Episcopal Church, and specifically ordained as a vocational deacon. And our role as deacons is to be the prophetic voice of the poor to the church and to the world. At 63, a little over 4 years ago, I made the decision to leave the health system where I'd worked for 16 years. It was a faith-inspired health system that had been sold to a for-profit company, and our mission shifted from extending the healing ministry of Jesus by improving the health of our communities with an emphasis on people who are poor and underserved to maximizing shareholder value. And while I have, I was grateful when I ran the foundation for all those shareholders who made donations to our foundation, it was not something I could do for the rest of my life. Shortly thereafter, I was offered the opportunity to serve as president of the Alliance for Better Nonprofits. This is an organization that was founded in 2014 by Dr. Alex Miller in the Haslam College of Business. We opened our doors in 2015, and we have about 400 nonprofit organizational members. We provide 60 to 70 trainings on all aspects of nonprofit leadership and management each year. We do anywhere from 50 to 90 consulting engagements. We provide a lot of access to resources, networking opportunities, and work on collective impact. And finally, and this may come as a surprise that it's in the context of a religious call, but in January of this year, I was elected as the chair of the Knoxville Utilities Board. We provide electric power, natural gas, water, and wastewater, and we're about to start something very exciting, which I'll come back to in just a moment. While ABN and KUB are secular organizations, my work in both is informed deeply by my baptismal vows and those vows I took upon ordination, and I'll speak again about this in a second. So now I'd like to shift focus for just a minute. In my experience, nonprofits do a lot of their work based on heart and gut. We see something that needs to be fixed, we see some human suffering, and we just have to do something about it. But the problem in both faith communities and nonprofits is that we tend to be really good at feeding the hungry, inviting the stranger, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and those in prison. But addressing the root causes that lead to hunger, alienation, poverty, illness, and imprisonment is much more difficult work, and we find it far more difficult to make an impact. So I thought that it might be useful to provide an example of where my faith commitments and my nonprofit leadership roles intersect in a way that I think will result in systemic change. Back in, and let me say that Professor Marshall, I was particularly inspired by your comments about rights versus charity. I think that what I'm about to say fits in that paradigm very well. I chaired the task force to Knox County Schools Reopening Task Force last summer. I was asked to chair a community group that would advise the school system on how to reopen in the midst of the pandemic. What became abundantly clear, it wasn't a new insight for me, but it was for a lot of our communities, the disparities that existed between those students who were poor and those students who were not poor, particularly as it related to access to the internet and to broadband services. We did everything we could do to try to get our for-profit broadband institutions to make broadband available to our poor students, particularly on the east side of the city. And we got turned down at every turn. I mean, there were some Band-Aids put on. So at KUB, we are now in the process of determining whether we can figure out a way to create a fifth public utility, which is a broadband service. Well, we will run fiber to every single house in our city, which will enable us to provide those services. So that's one way that we could, I think my faith commitments inspired my nonprofit work to use whatever influence I had to try to attack something at the system level versus just at the individual level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And we have a new partnership, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville College, which is an HBCU, and TCAT, which has a fiber optics program. Jerry, you'll be happy to know that we met with KUB last week to talk about the ways in which we might move that idea forward. Jeff Becker, if you would join us and give us your overview, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roz, for inviting me and to join this really prestigious, auspicious crowd of wonderful people, and to allow me to listen to Professor Marshall's talk, which was wonderful. So I just want to say I'm not a ordained rabbi or anything like that. I practice Judaism in a non-Orthodox way, but Judaism deeply imbues me with many of these concepts that allows me to address, I think, this issue of that we're talking about today. And in fact, one of the things that Jerry mentioned from Professor Marshall's talk about questions of rights and justice is exactly what I'm going to start with. Because in Judaism, there's a concept called tzedakah. Tzedakah is a Hebrew word which means righteousness, but commonly used to signify charity. But the concept of charity differs from the modern Western understanding of charity. The latter is typically understood as a spontaneous act of goodwill and a marker of generosity. Tzedakah, in the Jewish way, is an ethical obligation. Tzedakah refers to the religious obligation to do what is right and just, which Judaism emphasizes as an important part of living a spiritual life. Unlike philanthropy, tzedakah is seen as an obligation, a religious obligation that must be performed regardless of one's financial standing. And so it's mandatory, even for those of limited financial means. For example, in the biblical sense, one form of tzedakah was to allocate a portion of your field for harvest, for poor to harvest. The laws of tzedakah were laid down by Maimonides, a great Jewish scholar, philosopher who was born in Spain, in the last part of his life lived in Egypt in the 12th century. Maimonides listed 8 levels of giving written in his Mishnah Torah, and these were the laws about giving. The first and highest form of tzedakah is to give an interest-free loan to a person in need, or form a partnership in need with a person in need, or give a grant to a person in need, or find a job to a person in need, as long as the loan, grant, or partnership results in the person no longer relying upon others. The second level of tzedakah is giving anonymously to an unknown recipient via a person or a public fund that is trustworthy, wise, and can perform acts of tzedakah with the money in a most impeccable fashion. The third form of tzedakah, and as we go lower in their levels of giving, the third form is giving anonymously to a known recipient. The fourth form is to give publicly to an unknown recipient. The fifth form of tzedakah is giving before being asked. The sixth level, that's the sixth level, The sixth level is giving adequately after being asked. The seventh level is giving willingly, but inadequately. And the lowest level is giving unwillingly. So these are the forms of tzedakah, and I know Jerry knows these very well, that sort of guide the whole Jewish understanding of what tzedakah is. So let me tell you a little bit about the Knoxville Jewish community and what we are doing. About 20 years ago, I was instrumental in helping form what's called the Knoxville Community Family of Funds. This is a group of funds. Actually, now we started with about $100,000 in the fund. Now we have assets of over $4 million of 70 separate funds. These are donor advised funds and also designated funds or community funds. The whole organization of the Knoxville Family of Community Funds is a supporting organization of the East Tennessee Foundation, the foundation of which Jerry Askew was president when we started this association over 20 years ago. And The Knoxville Community Family Funds helps the donors decide who to give grants to, who to give tzedakah to, and then we invest these funds through the East Tennessee Foundation. Some specific philanthropic projects of the Knoxville Community Family Funds are Jewish Family Services, in which we support the elderly of Jews and persons in distress. Scholarships to camp, preschool, and the day school, and these scholarships are not religiously based. The camp at the Knoxville Jewish Community Center is about 40% Jewish kids and 60% non-Jewish kids. They're all equally eligible for scholarships. We have a new community garden nowhere near Pastor Battle's garden. It's a very small community garden, but we started last year. We're very excited about growing it. We give food donations from this community garden to Family Promise and other organizations. And we started a social justice interaction with various churches in town as well. But many more things that we do, but I think we're very proud of what we've established and want to continue this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Excuse me. We'll now have Imam Rafiq Mahdi of the Muslim community of Knoxville and Director of Disaster Relief and Outreach, Islamic Circle of North America.
Yes, good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Professor Hackett for inviting me to be part of this forum, and welcome and thank our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Marshall, for her speech and the insight that she has provided for all of us. Just briefly about myself, I'm a native Knoxvillian, and I attended Austin East High School, graduated from Austin East High School, was raised in the AME Zion Church, and at the age of 17, I was introduced to the Quran, and I began a study of the Quran. And at the age of 23, after a lot of self-reflection and travel, I accepted Islam as my faith. And once I accepted Islam as my faith, I began to try to make allegiances with other Muslims here in the Knoxville community. This was in 1979, 1980. Not very many Muslims at that time. We did not have a mosque at that time. So most of my connections were with students at the University of Tennessee who were coming from different parts of the world. And one of the things that I quickly discovered was, in order to further my understanding of the Islamic faith, that I needed to learn the Arabic language. And that, of course, led me to travel to other parts of the world: Sudan, Saudi Arabia, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, where I experienced Islamic culture firsthand, but at the same time being born and raised here in Knoxville, Tennessee, and learning about Islam from the perspective of the teachings of the Quran, I discovered that there was a disconnect between the actual teachings and some of the culture that we find in different parts of the world, in different societies that are indeed Muslim societies. So after my formal studies in Saudi Arabia, I returned to the United States and began working in the Muslim community here, and subsequently was asked to serve communities as imams in Florida and here in Knoxville as well. But always thinking about things from the perspective of what should we be bringing to the society as Muslims? Indeed, what should we be bringing to the society as individuals? You know, there's a statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he was asked by one of his contemporaries, which people are most loved by Allah? And of course, Allah is the name that we give for the one true God, and the God of Abraham, and the God of Jesus, the son of Mary. And that he was asked, what is it that, who are the most beloved people to the Creator? And his reply was, the most beloved people to the Creator are the ones who bring the most benefit to mankind. And this is a very comprehensive statement that it's not dependent upon one religion or one nationality or one particular ideology, but those whom they bring the most benefit to mankind. And I was very taken by that quote from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I began to try to see ways or look for ways where I could fulfill that, because one of the things that I strive to do is to be in the good graces of our Creator, who will be the source of success in this life and the next life. And in doing so, I became involved with an effort to help after a flooding event in Nashville, Tennessee. Just went down with some volunteers and wanted to try to help clean up and bring some food and bring some comfort to those who have been impacted by the events there. And I think in 2011 or 2010, and subhanAllah, we know that they just had recent flooding there as well. So kind of a similar event. But that was when I ran across a group of individuals who were volunteering as well, some of them from the Jewish community, some of them from the Muslim community, some of them from the Christian community, from the Buddhist community, and all staying together at one house and eating together and going out and working all day and coming back in the evening. So it was through that experience that I became involved with the Islamic Circle of North America, which is a nonprofit organization here in the United States, a faith-inspired organization, inspired by the Islamic faith, Muslims throughout the country. And we also have something that we call zakat, which is like sadaqah that Jeffrey mentioned, that we have to give a certain amount of our wealth to those in need. So we have channeled that in a way that we are providing services for hunger prevention, medical services and free clinics, and educational services and scholarships, that we are doing disaster response, disaster relief work, and services for homeless women who are finding themselves in need. And we are doing this throughout the country. And we hope that we will broaden our footprint here in Tennessee and Knoxville as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We have a couple, excuse me, of connections. I'm also an Austin East graduate, and I was on faculty at Tennessee State University, which is HBCU, during the flood of 2010. So I remember that very, very vividly. And thank you for all that you and the entire volunteer base was able to do during that time. Pastor Chris Battle, founder of Battlefield Farms and Gardens.
Good evening. Again, my name is Chris Battle, and I moved here in 2008 from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is my hometown, and to pastor the Tabernacle Baptist Church. And one of the ventures that we did first was to clean Oddfellow Cemetery, the cemetery right across the street on Martin Luther King here in Knoxville. And those who are housed there were all born in slavery. And it was a mess. It was overgrown, headstones turned over. And so I organized a group of us, about 30 of us went out there one fall morning, and we began to clean it. We're mowing, we're raking, we're putting headstones back up. We got bags and bags of debris in the corner of the cemetery. A gentleman pulls up in a pickup truck and begins to thank us for what we're doing. And he gets historical. He talks about how he was a kid. He used to cut through there to get to school, and just going on and on and on. And me being the new pastor in town, me growing up, learning about evangelism, and I went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Don't hold that against me. But and so we were in all that. And so my first response was, well, brother, won't you come join us at the church right across the street? And this was his response to me. He looked me in the eye and he said, I'm not coming to your damn church. And he drove off. And that plagued me. It still plagues me. Over a decade, that response just plagued me. And, why'd he cuss my church? And then, later on, a few years later, we learned from a study that First Baptist Concord did that in 2016, that 80% of Knoxvillians don't go to church. 20% go on a regular basis, and regular is considered once a month. Roughly 40% of that 80 have no religious affiliation. The other 40% have some religious affiliation, but they do not go to church. In the buckle of the Bible Belt, 80% of Knoxvillians don't go to church. And it began to dawn on me, said, maybe I need to do church differently, but I don't know what that looks like. I've been pastoring over 30 years. I'm getting old. I'm kind of stuck in my ways. But then we had a plot of land, and I began to do I've always did a little gardening. And so we've got a plot of land at the church, and I decided to do a little garden over there. It was then when I learned about food disparity and food desert here in East Knoxville. And the USDA says if you're 1/3 of your community is more than a mile away from a grocery store or farmer's market, you're considered a food desert. For where we were located, the USDA says a mile away. We were 2 miles away from the closest store. And of course, some say this is not really a food desert, it's more like food apartheid, because this affects usually communities of color or poor communities. And so what I decided then, I said, it was then that I didn't realize it then, that the trajectory of my life and my ministry was about to change. I began to reach out. We started a community garden instead of my garden. And then I asked some of my pastor friends if they had some vacant land. They opened up their land to use as community gardens. Stop and Go, a corner store, opened up their land. Matter of fact, Bridge Refugees with Drosella, they are using that land as a community garden. And we also got with some other organizations to fight this whole food disparity thing, and started the Eastside Farmers Market that goes every Sunday during the month of June and through September here in East Knoxville, trying to fight food disparity. And then all of a sudden, a small urban farm came open that was called Afield, and they needed somebody to run it. And for some reason, I raised my hand, and I became the owner of a farm, and we changed the name to Battlefield Farm, and we are fighting food disparity and trying to create community. But what I've learned is that since I've become a quote unquote farmer, when I introduce myself, people ask me what I do, I don't say I'm a pastor, I say I'm a farmer. Because when I tell people I'm a pastor, everything changes. Their conversation changes, they quit cussing, they hide their liquor, all that. But when I tell them I'm a farmer, they start telling me what color their thumb is. And they'll start asking me questions about, well, do you have cattle or whatever, thing like that? No, I just got chickens. But what I've learned is, as a farmer, I have met more people across racial lines, denominational lines, religious lines, who will come together to meet at the farm. And what we're trying to do is to create Jeffrey, shalom, this wholeness, this community here where we can find wholeness and peace. And we can do that in the dirt, but we couldn't do it in a building. And so that's what I think happened, is that his compliments turned to consternation. But yet I think if I were to ever meet him again now, I believe his consternation would turn to collard greens.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. I love it. Heartfelt, real, timely, relevant. And thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. Let us go on to Manisha. She's our family medicine specialist and also representing the Hindu Community Center of Knoxville.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel. Thank you, Professor Katherine Marshall. Really inspirational, and Pastor Battle, that was just fantastic. So I feel very tiny being amongst all of you, because I'm not in any form or fashion as educated or as much of a practitioner of a religious discipline as all of you. I represent, as Dr. Marshall said, a tiny community level organization. So the Hindu community in Knoxville, if you look it up, it's less than 0.01% of the total population of Greater Knoxville. Our community center was established by buying a plot of land in 1978 and progressed to a little bit of a bigger plot of land in 1988, and a structure was finally built in 1991. The physical structure simply gives a place for practice of a very old form of it's sort of difficult to call it a form of worship. It's really a philosophy, a practice of living that people can call Hinduism. We really know for it to be the unending religion, Sanatana Dharma. It doesn't have a beginning and it will not have an end. And the center gives us a identity. It allows us to have a little spot of meaning in the East Tennessee diaspora. It is entirely a charitable organization. It is built on donations, maintained and funded by donations by its members. We have 2 active priests. The center provides us a place of worship, but also a community center where young and old can have an identity in and of themselves, not separate from the communities that we have moved to, but as an integral part of those, to allow us to center and allow us to be able to carry on our belief system, in that we are part of a much greater community. Our founding principles are those of Karma, and Karma is the simple philosophy of cause and effect. The actions of each individual will have an effect on every other individual around them and on themselves. We believe that disinterested actions don't have the same effect as interested or intentional actions, and thereby the fruits of those can be manyfold. We can have the fruits or benefits that we see, but then also what we call the sanskar that transcends into who we become. And as those of us that follow the Hindu philosophy understand, we know that we are here for a purpose. Our efforts are by practicing compassion and empathy, engage in the community to which we have, in which we have been placed. The Hindu Community Center does have many charities that it contributes to, but our belief system allows us to participate in any good action performed by any community professing to any religion or form of religious practice. So we very regularly contribute to the Love Kitchen, we contribute to the Smiles of Hope, we contribute to many churches, whether they are of the Christian, Judaic or Muslim faith. We're not bound by ties that tell us that we can only contribute to people that practice their faith in a certain manner. It's sort of a misconception that Hinduism is very rigid. It's actually the furthest from, but being a very old religion, we have freedom to practice in whichever form or fashion we would like. I feel honestly very humbled that I was allowed to speak for the community. It's a very tiny community, but there's many illustrious members in our group that know much more than I do. And I think I was allowed to speak because my husband and I, we started just a little event for children that allowed the younger children of our community to form an identity by practice of a ritual that was for them, by them, and allowed them to network and improve their understanding of themselves, because we do believe that you can't understand others unless you understand yourself. During COVID, during the pandemic, during the many sad things that we have all seen, members of our community have been able to rely on our firm belief in science. Science is truth, and truth always sets you free. And from that, we've tried to spread the word of the vaccine, of treatments, of early testing. We've tried to be adaptive, to listen, to open our doors and ask that other doors be open so that we can redefine how we are successful in moving through the pandemic. As far as the nonprofit aspect of our community goes, well, in our philosophy, everything should not be for profit, and the benefits we get are so manifold that the profits are too many to be counted. I know I'm probably speaking too much and exceeding my time, so I'm grateful to be a part of this very, very amazing group of people, and grateful that I've been allowed to speak. Thank you.
Yes, no, I was just giving you your 1 minute warning. So if you have any last minute burning things to say, by all means do so. If not, we certainly can pass the torch, but I just wanted to kind of let you know.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So if you give me a moment, I'll take a moment more. When Professor Hackett allowed me to talk about the nonprofit part of any religious organization and that intersection between the business and the religious community, again, I think that we feel so privileged to be able to speak to that, because there should not be in our philosophy a difference between the business of life and the empathy and compassion of life. So nonprofit organizations that are faith-based or faith-inspired are in the continuum of what we would hope to contribute to allow the community, the greater Knoxville community, East Tennessee community, to let us have a voice and a place. And just the fact that all of you've included me in this is testimony to that. Thank you. I went over a minute. I know I did.
Just a few seconds. You're good. I'm keeping us on target. So thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Reagan Shriver is our associate professor of practice at the College of Social Work here at the University of Tennessee, and also special assistant to the president of Catholic Charities USA and former executive director of Catholic Charities of East Tennessee. So we will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. But boy, this is a hard act to follow in. And I just love this ever extending arm of love and acceptance that's being expressed here is just really amazing and very touching to me. So just a real quick bit about my story. I started off, I was a high school teacher in my first years as a priest. And there we were sort of selling this one thing, to our students, this wonderful way of viewing things. And then luckily I was able to step into the role of being the executive director of the Catholic Charities Agency here in East Tennessee, which is part of a larger network of Catholic Charities social service agencies across the country. In fact, there's 176 different agencies across the country that are serve over 12 million people last year. But I think about this thing, and I'm so grateful for that, because I think true to some of the things that you all have expressed, that my colleagues have expressed so far, has been this: I have found an expanding image of God. In fact, as the executive director of a social agency, Catholic Charities, I found myself, as a priest, that I thought I'd be preaching a lot, and that would be my life's work. But I found myself days and days going and doing my work without ever saying the word God or saying the word Jesus or referring to that at all. but every bit of my heart or my fiber of my being knew that I was living out a mission of goodness and a mission of God that we call by many names. And I just felt like I just knew that. I didn't have to talk about it. I knew that I was doing it, and I knew that the colleagues that I was working with every day were doing it as well. And that just filled me with such great excitement. And so I think about that because I reflect on this statement. Actually, what Chris Battle, what you said, calling yourself a farmer, I love that that kind of an image, because I feel like that's kind of what we were about. We were being social workers for folks that needed it the most. And so there's this statement from St. Francis, who's a Catholic saint. You see him a lot in gardens. He's probably would freak out to know that he's made millions for people selling himself as a garden statue. But anyway, he said, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, you can use words. And so I love that image, because I feel like that's what the nature of the nonprofit sector can be from a faith-based, inspired perspective. So that's really great. Well, just a couple of things that I feel like are philosophy that are really important for me to just kind of share is, and what I feel like I've heard a thread through the whole thing is the dignity of the human person. That that every single page of the scriptural text from the Judeo-Christian history and from what I've learned about the Quran, that every page talks about that somebody's being respected or giving dignity by God. From the moment of God breathing life into the human figure and creating humanity, up until a woman who had been had 7 demons possessed her is the one proclaiming the message of the resurrection. Every page is about the dignity of the human person. And that's what I just loved about working at Catholic Charities, was this image of being able to just constantly be able to work and relate with people. That there was no one that we wouldn't serve and no one that we wouldn't engage with. And we did all just kinds of services. And so it was a great experience. Another really important part of the philosophy of my faith that I think was exercised in the action of the Catholic Charities Agency work was that this concept of a preferential option for the poor. This is a liberation theology sort of perspective or statement that's come out and years ago. And I love that statement because it says, it acknowledges that those who are poor, if we reflect on that, those who are poor are missing out on healthy food, missing out on good health care, missing out on clothing, healthy clothing, missing out on housing. So because of all those things, they are closer to death than the non-poor. So I think about that, and I think about how we are called to have a preferential option. So whenever we are making decisions in our society through policy or through program implementation or whatever, that we're called to have this preferential concern or sort of a little bit of an eye out for people who are poor because of the relationship of them being closer to death. That is just a really important message. I use the example of that, like I would be out babysitting my 2 nieces. One's 2, one's 5. I'm out in the front yard and babysitting them. And who do I keep a special eye out? A little bit more for the 2-year-old because she's a bit more vulnerable. So I think about this little example and think about this image of how we are called to have a preferential concern, a preferential eye, a preferential treatment for those who are poor. Not that every single person doesn't have complete worth and value and reflection of God's love and dignity, but folks who are poor, we should be giving a special attention to. That's why I'm so psyched of all the things the Catholic Church has done, that they've created this arm and extension that's a pluralistic platform for people of all different faiths and all different backgrounds to come serve and also to be served. And so I love that. And I feel like it's truly in the vein of what we've heard over and over from my colleagues here today, that concept. One thing I think that's been kind of a struggle for us is that whole idea of how do we do this? How do we do this in like this faith tradition of preferential option for the poor, dignity for the human person, and all those things? How do we take those great philosophies and then put them into some sort of structure that meets the nonprofit requirements, meets grant requirements for government grants, that meets funding expectations for donors? How do we take all this great philosophy and put it into a way that's going to sell or a way that's going to fit within these formats? It can be done, and sometimes not very easily, but it can be done. And I think that something that I've found the importance of really gathering people together and getting people's input and hearing what people have to say about this, the approach of the organization is really super important. So I feel like I could go on and say a billion things. When I was asked to speak on this, I was so glad because I feel like that when you said religion and nonprofit, oh my gosh, that's my whole life. Now that I'm at UT, I'm super psyched to be able to teach in the social work program, and we have a concentration that teaches about how to manage nonprofit agencies, and so I get to teach in that and kind of pass on the good word about it. So I think that's kind of what I'd just a bit like to share, I guess.
Thank you so much. Can I say, I just want to bottle some of your energy up. If y'all don't feel that passion and commitment and energy as he talks about love, compassion, understanding, worth, dignity, the least of these, quite frankly, I just feel it. I love it. Thank you for being obedient. And I'm sure of the many sacrifices that you've made throughout your professional and personal journey. So thank you so much for that, Reagan. And then we are going to have Drusilla round us out. She's Executive Director of Bridge Refugee Services. So we will turn it over to you, Ms. Drusilla.
Thank you. If it was not because of faith, I would not be here. Today you see me shining and smiling, but it was not always like that. I experienced the second darkest time in my life in 2008 when I was forced to flee my country after surviving genocide in 1994. I fled my country, Rwanda, because of persecution based on my opinion, and those opinions were more likely based on my Christian principles. Imagine fleeing your country without any destination, not knowing where you are going. I was angry, I was confused, I was disoriented, I was scared, but also I was hopeful. And I'm very glad that America gave me a second chance. I did have to rebuild from scratch in a new culture, no friends, no family to rely on, but I'm grateful still that America has this life-saving program, and I want to see it being sustained as it has been for decades. Religion plays a big role in refugee life. The refugee resettlement is a public and private partnership, and we cannot do it by ourselves. I will just focus on two of our core values. Welcoming the stranger is not only a duty, but it is also a privilege. And then the other one is like dignity for all. We believe in dignity for all. The first ask I made when I came as a refugee, when I landed the night in Knoxville, I did ask them to connect me to my church, the Catholic Church, to see a priest. And then the Northside Christian Church, who was co-sponsoring me, and the case manager took me to see Monsignor Menko at Holy Ghost Church. He had my confession. I had my communion. It was like having a warm shower in revival. Faith-based organizations are the core group of our supporters and founders. Bridge Refugee Services is a community organization affiliated to Episcopal Migration Ministries, the one of 9 national resettlement agencies. Most of community assistance teams and volunteers come from faith-inspired organization. I will borrow this word from Professor Marshall. They provide a bunch of in-kind donations, and a few of them provide English as a second language, and we recruit mentors from churches and other places of worship. Even though religion plays a big role in refugee life, every community, faith-based or inspired partner sign a commitment of non-proselytizing. We are serving people from 12 nationalities. Some are Christian, some are Muslim, some do not have a religion. So we have to serve them according to their needs, but not because of a religion they belong to. The COVID response from inspired organizations was very remarkable. Refugees were not left behind, even we did get funding to help them for the virtual learning, which is the new culture of the moment. We connect clients to community resources. And as a leader, I have to advocate for the program. I have to make sure that the program is understood, refugees' voices are heard, and we have enough resources to provide to their needs. We experienced the anti-refugee rhetoric and misinformation that created a distrust among our communities. The refugee settlement program, as I say, is a humanitarian program. It's not a political program, even if there are political decisions made to sustain the program, but people are turning it to a political program. They are bringing social, cultural, and economic values to our communities. They are not a burden. We are giving, even though many people think we are takers, we give more than what we receive. If I ask you, if now we had to run the way we are, maybe we have just one clothes, no money on us. So when you get somewhere, what you need food, you need shelter. If you have children, you want them to go to school, you need health care, and that is humanitarian program. And if you are not familiar with the program, I invite you to visit our website, which is bridgerefugees.org. And you can get involved in different ways by volunteering, donate your time, your talents, and part of your treasure, and educate your peers about refugees. And if you are not educated, we are there to help you to understand the program. And I want to say, as Father said, Catholic Charities is in Nashville, and they are managing the federal funds to help refugees to adjust in our communities. Integration takes time, and we need every one of you and your friends so our new neighbors and refugees can thrive in our community. Professor Marshall talked about how are we interdependent. America and the whole world needs refugees, and refugees need America, refugees need us. So let us be welcoming and keep people informed. And I'm here to respond to all the questions. I'm grateful that I'm alive, I can serve again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's always a pleasure to be with you, to hear your very, very powerful story and testimony, and the place from which you've come. So thank you again for all that you do. At this time, we are going to open the question and answer session up for our roundtable speakers. So if anyone has a question, feel free to include it in the chat. As you think about those questions, as you think about, and ponder over everything that our speakers have asked thus or discussed thus far, I would just mention that I don't necessarily have a question in the chat right now. Doesn't mean it's not coming, but I do have a lingering question from our keynote speaker, so perhaps she can speak to this question as we receive the additional questions. And that has to do with the fact that the U.S. is supposed to be a nation of separation of church and state. This prevents many quote unquote churches from getting involved in politics, yet churches have a lot to say about ethics and let me see, it's cut off there. Ethics that should be followed in our politics. What do you have to say about that issue, Professor Marshall? So it's related to separation of church and state and the kind of ethical and moral position of the church.
Well, first, I want to say how much I enjoyed listening to each of you. And I think you make the case, the defense rests that the role and the diversity of what you've spoken about. And you also touched on some points that I had meant to talk about. For example, trying to understand the prophetic voice what does that mean? How do we go beyond the mundane into really seeing a better future on the preferential option for the poor? On church and state, I alluded to that very briefly with the religious freedom issue, and it's a subject of a lot of discussion, and I would have to admit tension right now. But the first thing is, first of all, the wall of separation that we all know in the United States basically means that religious institutions are supposed to be free of government intervention. But there is a huge involvement of religious institutions of many kinds in American politics. I'm reading a book these days called The Power Worshippers, which is basically linking how some of the religious ideas are permeating and accentuating, I think, the culture wars. So I think that is that's a reality that we need to face about, and there's no solution to it given the diversity of religious ideas, but to try to, in places like this and like your university, to have a conversation about what it means. The issue of ethics, which I also touched on briefly, as I said, I worked for an institution, the World Bank, which in many ways, to my mind, is profoundly ethical. And yet the conversation tended to be very technocratic. The concept of fairness was often expressed in statistics. In other words, you want to make sure that you measure and therefore that you are sure that you're focusing on the poorest people or on people in greatest need. And so the ethical dilemmas that we all face of what is our role and what is the best path and why are people resisting, which I alluded to a little bit in this vaccine case study. All of that is difficult. So I could go on, but I won't. So I hope I've at least started to address the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And again, for our audience, we are in this together. If you have any question that you just like to have clarified, want to probe, dig a little bit deeper as we think about the multiple ways that nonprofit and religion intersects, as we think about the pressing grand challenges, quite frankly, both domestically and internationally, the many, many wicked problems and social problems that we have, and the ways that religion and religious diversity can address those issues socially, philanthropically, morally, so on and so forth. Any other questions?
Well, if no one else is asking a question, I have one quick one, which is, what is the situation with refugee resettlement right now in the Knoxville area? I mean, we know that the ceilings were cut drastically and now have been opened up. So both, what is the practical solution? What is the path ahead?
The path ahead is that, that the presidential determination is up to 15,000 countrywide. So from October 1st, so we are in the Eastern Tennessee, we have an office also in Chattanooga. So we did welcome 12 refugees from October 1st until today. And we were expecting to have 150 this year. But with the pandemic, even if the numbers will go up, I think we are getting prepared for next year. Realistically, I don't expect many to come beyond what we projected before, but I am pleased that we have a good community support. The main challenges, like any American, are facing the biggest challenge is affordable housing. And then when I was asking question about how the nonprofit fight poverty, my main concern in this country, homelessness, hunger, and affordable housing. I used to be in the government myself, and I say, if I can give a hand, I can help. We have land, we have trees, really having homelessness and not having enough houses in these countries is not for me something which I feel it's a shame, if I can say. So we are planning to see how we can extend in the future in the surrounding counties. So the limiting factors are housing, transportation, but up to now, jobs are available. And I'm always saying that the refugee resettlement program can serve as an economic model for low income and other marginalized families. If you come here and don't speak English, but within 4 to 6 months, you can be employed and pay your bills, I think many people can learn from that program. Hopefully I did respond to your question, but we are very excited to be more welcoming into America can do more.
And we have a great ambassador, champion, advocate, Intercellus, and thank you for everything that you do. Father Reagan, did you have a question?
Well, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I was going to just say one thing but I was going to build on, maybe if I could respond a little bit to what Professor Marshall was saying about the separation of church and state. This is something that in Catholic Charities nationally and locally that we tried to straddle so much that that we wanted to be an advocate for good policies that were for the clients that we were serving, like what Drusilla was just saying, appropriate housing and advocating for better housing and funding for safer housing and lifting the cap on refugees and all those things. But then I think when we dabbled it, if we were to get into the area of what partisan group to back, then that's where I feel like it was wrong, or that was the distance I felt like that we should be from. So I feel like that kind of that separation of church and state kind of comes from we don't want to be backing anybody in particular. And I think sometimes I feel frustrated by this concept of religious freedom, because I think sometimes it's just code for discrimination or taking away people's choices, and that's frustrating. So anyway, that was my little thought on that.
And I wanted to add a little bit also where we have seen faith-inspired, faith-based organization leaders where the government wanted the states and local governments to consent for refugee resettlement in our areas. They did play big. So they signed petition because it was against the core values of those inspired organizations. And we did see many letters to the governor to say, no, this is not who we are. We want to welcome refugees. It's a program we support. So we did see a big support in that area, and we are very thankful that really they stood upon their values.
One of the things that I'll do a little bragging also, like some others have done on Reagan's good work. I think, I don't know what the statistics are, but I know that the overwhelming number of people served by Catholic Charities were not Roman Catholic. And so I think that's a way that we can think of how our faith can guide our nonprofit leadership. We are there to serve all persons. We may be inspired by our own faith journey, but our own faith journey can, if we are open-minded about it, can lead us to serve all people of all faiths or no faith at all. And I think we're carrying out the mission that each of our faith traditions has called us to carry out by taking that position.
Thank you so much for that added commentary. We do have a question for Pastor Battle. Why do you think quote unquote religion is so off-putting for so many people?
I think that I was born and raised Baptist, and I think what has happened is that, to be a good Baptist, you had to believe a certain way, behave a certain way, then you could belong. And what ended up happening is that people didn't want to behave the way that they perceived these so-called good people that were behaving. A lot of times they saw our hypocrisy. A lot of times I think they still feel that there's a certain amount of irrelevance, that the religions become irrelevant to the particular needs. Sometimes we're scratching where people are not itching. We see, I'm teaching a class at Johnson University on thriving church. And my basic presupposition is this: if the community around your local church is not thriving, then your church is not thriving. And because so oftentimes the church and the community are two separate entities. Our churches don't look like our communities. And I think that's a part of the push-off. I think that there's this perception of what the faith is about. And, you know, I got to dress a certain way. I got to talk a certain way, have to act a certain way. And without question and without any deep thought about, well, why do I have to act this way? Or why am I supposed to act this way? And so I think that's part of the reason. I think I could probably write a book on that. I've been to church all my life. My parents met at church. I think my grandparents met at church. My great-grandparents met at church. But yet now I even begin to question, what are why are we holding on to these things that do not speak to the pain of people who we see every day, that do not speak to that homeless person who was beneath the shadows of our steeples, who does not speak to the refugee, who does not speak to the homeless, who does not speak to the poor, who does not speak to people of color or what have you. And I think that is what has put off. It's all about Sunday, it's all about a building, but yet we haven't made it about the personality and the person. I think that's part of the reason why it has put people off.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much for that. And again, as I think about everything that I have heard, I've just been inspired, enlightened by the entire panel and roundtable speakers and the keynote. And I think and I'll tell you why. I think because people have been very genuine, authentic, and real. And you didn't use those words, Pastor Battle, but I think that's essentially what you were saying. That's what people are looking for, hoping for, longing for. People that just can, as the young folks would say, keep it 100. That could just be real, right? And that it hasn't always been this way for members of the clergy, for leaders, for whatever your particular professional and personal journeys have been. And I think often that is absolutely what folks are hungry for. I see you rearing up, Jerry. are you going to say something or just, okay. All right, just checking. We have a friend from Ireland. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. She says, I'm really enjoying listening to all the speakers and having an interest in indigenous religions. I wondered, do the faith-inspired groups have any indigenous representation both at home and abroad? And do people know of groups helping with indigenous people of the world, particularly around COVID?
May I speak to that?
Absolutely, Dr. Manisha.
It's Manisha, please. The other sounds, it's Manisha, please. So yes, in those of us, so again, representing the Hindu Community Center, but as followers of the Hindu faith, it's really individual responsibility. So individually, members of the community have been engaged in helping indigenous populations, and I'm just talking about the Native American population in various sectors, and being able to, in this instance, with COVID relief, being able to educate being able to spread the word that the vaccine is safe, being able to make sure that the lines of communication between healthcare providers and people who may not have access to healthcare as readily as some of us are privileged to have, trying to individually establish those connections so that we don't have to go through many steps that sometimes big organizations have to in getting things approved and funds approved, to be able to make individual contributions and go out individually as members of HCC or the Hindu Community Center to be able to say, this is my Saturday morning, I'm going to go out and try and talk to people about this and trying to educate about the vaccine. That would just be what we're doing from our community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I don't know about the rest of the panel and speakers and the audience, but I can't believe that our time has come to an end. We have just about 5 minutes left, and we are going to use these final 5 minutes to receive some closing remarks from both Professor Marshall and Timothy Munyon, who is Associate Professor of Management in the Consortium for Social Enterprise Effectiveness in the Haslam College of Business. So I will turn it over to the both of you for our closing remarks. And thank you all again so much. It's been a pleasure for me to moderate the session.
Please, Professor Marshall, I'm happy to defer to you.
Well, you've heard a lot from me, and I came and wanted to join this so that I would have a chance to learn. And I have riches. I want to bottle a lot of what you said. So thank you so much for welcoming me. I think that we really need to commit ourselves to taking advantage of this extraordinary crisis we've lived through, so that we do learn from some of the obvious lessons and maybe some of the less obvious lessons, and really find ways to come together, as you obviously are coming together in this community, to try to address some of the inequalities and unfairness and pain that people are suffering, because we know that it is possible to have a better world. So thank you all.
And I echo your comments. I've been very inspired just to hear these examples of how people are actually living out their faith. I'm a person of faith also. For 37 years, I followed Jesus and tried to do my best to live to honor the Lord and also to love my neighbor as myself, and the highest Christian calling. If I can offer one final encouragement to the group before we close, it would be this. Don't walk away from this time inspired and embracing the ideas of transformation, but without a plan to actually be a transformation. The Apostle James said that faith without works is dead. And I think that there is an amazing power in that we show our faith, we show our love for God by our acts of service to others around us. And if that's fostering, if that's gardening, advocacy for justice, for victims, for refugees, people suffering from homelessness, mentoring at-risk children, find your place. Like, find the place where you want to personally invest and go do it. Don't wait for government. Don't wait for a church congregation. Don't wait for somebody else to lead the pack. Let us lead with those actions. And I think the example that we see in each of these respective, the panelists, goodness gracious, we see people who are taking action and actually trying to shed light and love in the world around them. And to me, that is the greatest encouragement that we can take away from this afternoon. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much for participating and giving your time. And shalom, salam, and peace be upon all of us.
If I may just, before we close, I'd really like to recognize not only my friend and colleague from Ireland, but we also have a graduate student from South Africa, from the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, Sakina Dramat. Sakina, I'm so glad you were able to join us. She's at the University of the Western Cape. And we had a Nigerian earlier. So, I mean, yes, we're not meeting face to face, but I think this meeting, I hope that it's done for you what it has done for me, that the positive aspects of meeting virtually, right? We have a recording of this event. We hope that others will be able to benefit from all that has been heard and shared. And so I really want to thank you. This has exceeded my expectations. You were all so good about keeping to the time frame, and our wonderful moderator was definitely in the driving seat on that. And thanks again to Katherine for her inspiring speech, and to all those of you. We had, I think at one point, about 60 participants. So that's not good. That's not bad for a first time around with this type of meeting, putting together religion and nonprofit leadership. So I hope that at very least Reagan, our department can cooperate better with yours now that you're there. So we need to do that. We have good links with the business school, and I want to thank Kitty Cornett for making these connections happen. So I just am very grateful, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening, and let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you all. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with everyone on the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
you.
Professor
Thank
Katherine,
you.
I want to keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Please
Mindy.
do.
I will.
Beautiful symposium. Thanks.